On the 30th of April 1851, a huge crowd came from far and wide to this racecourse in the northwest of England to watch the Chester Cup.
2-1 the field, without the field.
It was the railways that made such large gatherings possible. Thousands of racegoers travelled on special excursion trains, sending the Cup's attendance rates soaring.
The expanding transport network was at the heart of a modern, powerful Britain, bursting with energy and confidence. Railways were transforming our world from the 1800s and well into the 20th century, from where we work and what we eat to how we spend our leisure time. Thanks to the railways, horse racing's Chester Cup became established as a great sporting holiday, a time for fun and escape.
As the era of steam gathered pace, the summer of 1851 would prove to be a watershed moment in the history of our nation and for a new and exciting age of leisure.
Today, most of us take rail travel for granted. We use trains for easy getaways and staycation breaks, for everything from sporting events to music festivals. Before the railways, it was a different story.
For one thing, travelling around the country was a very slow business. Only royalty and the moneyed classes could afford the time and expense of going on holiday. For the average factory worker, toiling 12 or 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, the very idea of frolicking about on a beach would have seemed completely pie in the sky. Many had never even seen the sea.
With the opening of the pioneering Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, everything changed. Almost immediately, the railway began carrying sightseers. They came to look in appreciation at the world's earliest major railway viaduct, here in Sankey, midway between Liverpool and Manchester. The cost of travelling along this architectural wonder was the pricey sum of 5 shillings per passenger. At the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, a replica of a locomotive built for that route is still in regular use for the benefit of visitors. The Planet was designed and built by Robert Stephenson.
The Sankey sightseers were in the vanguard of what was about to become a leisure revolution. The railways eventually would offer immense freedom and opportunity to many of the nation's ordinary working men and women. But back in 1830, passengers departing from here, the booking hall of the brand new Liverpool and Manchester Railway, would have been slightly sceptical.
A scepticism born from the fact that these new trains had been designed with freight in mind, rather than passengers and luggage.
Originally, the railway companies thought that carrying goods, in particular coal and minerals and the like, would be the best way of making a profit. But they soon realised that actually there was fantastic demand for passengers to travel by rail. And that's because people couldn't really get about before without the railways. So the railways offer them maybe the first opportunity of visiting the local market town or visiting relatives in distant parts of the country and the like. And so it really opened up England in a way that had never happened before.
This widening of travel opportunities across the social classes wasn't welcomed by all.
There's this fundamental contradiction between the idea of opening up places and people being worried that really the hoi polloi are going to be coming and spoiling the view.
Indeed, the upper echelons of early Victorian society were suspicious of the very idea of leisure time for the masses.
They feared that inactivity could lead to social and political disorder, and the middle classes felt a moral duty to educate the working masses about self-improvement. Spare time, they believed, had its dangers.
Nearly a century before the state began to provide free education, rail companies were offering Sunday school children from local mills excursions. Trips that could be fun but had to have a moral purpose.
In the middle of the 19th century, there was a lot of feeling amongst middle class people that the working classes needed to be protected from the sort of things that they got up to, such as gambling, racing, beer shops. So this is an area where railway excursions came in, and it was a kind of moral reform.
Excursions soon became a national pastime and would quickly become big business. Perhaps the most famous of those early excursion entrepreneurs was Thomas Cook, who started by organising trains to temperance meetings in the early 1840s. But despite Cook's enduring legacy, he was not alone.
When people talk about railway excursions, the name that usually comes to mind is Thomas Cook. He features in all the railway history books. But there were other people operating at the same time that were much more important to the ordinary person. And one of the most important in his day was a chappie called Henry Marcus, who was Liverpool based, who was contracted with the London and North Western Railway. And by the time he'd finished, he'd carried 1.5 million passengers on his excursions. And yet, unfortunately, nobody's ever heard of him because he finished in 1869. He was, generally speaking, a one-man business, and he didn't leave any records, so nobody knows about him, apart from what you can find in newspaper advertisements and handbills.
Excursions that were morally improving were very important to early railway revenues, but catering to people's vices was just as important as catering to their virtues.
Trips to the horse races were an important source of early railway revenue, and the railways boosted the number of spectators at venues like Chester Racecourse throughout the 1800s and well into the 20th century.
The railways transformed the sport of horse racing because horses could be taken by train straight to the meet, being fresh and race ready. Top jockeys could travel around the country to ride at different meetings, and it helped to build up a nationwide programme of events.
Racecourses at places like Newbury, Cheltenham and Aintree would eventually have their own stations. The station at Epsom Downs, home of the Derby, would end up with 9 platforms designed to cope with the massive influx of trains on race days. As well as horse racing, another of the first spectator sports to be helped by the railways was prize fighting. It's amazing to think that large crowds travelled around the country to watch bare-knuckle fights, laying bets on men beating each other to a bloody pulp.
Prize fights were actually illegal, bare-knuckle boxing, so the organisers would hold the event probably at the boundary between 2 different counties, so you didn't know which police force was in charge. And all the people would arrive, the supporters of one prize fight on one train and the prize fight on the other train. They would hold the event in a field nearby, and then after the event they'd get back in their respective trains and go away again.
It was treated as being a dubious enterprise and frowned on even at the time. Later, in 1868, Parliament ended up banning railway companies from running prize fight specials.
Sport was one thing, but the Victorians also used the new rail network to attend fashionable events that involved spectators, sometimes with a macabre twist.
Public executions had always drawn crowds, and now special execution trains were laid on for willing spectators.
This quiet park in Liverpool was once the site of Kirkdale Jail, and on execution days they would hang people on the scaffolding in full view of the public. On the 12th of September 1863, excursion trains brought thousands upon thousands of people to jostle for the best view to see Jose Maria Alvarez, John Hughes, James O'Brien and Benjamin Thomas hang for murder. A correspondent from the Liverpool Mercury reported, "Never before was seen such a mass of people at an execution at Kirkdale. At 11:45, there were over 100,000 persons on the ground, and this number was increased by large arrivals of excursionists from Huddersfield and Blackburn, up to the last moment too. The rush of people from Liverpool was something extraordinary. Shortly after midday, the 4 convicted murderers were dispatched simultaneously, and the well-behaved, if morbid, crowd simply dispersed and went home. 5 years later, Parliament ordered that in future no executions would take place outside prisons. In the 1840s, the railway excursion business really took off. Modern West Coast mainline trains can carry 600 passengers in 11 coaches, the 2 hours journey it takes from Manchester to London. But at the start of the railway age, they went for something bigger. Much bigger.
This was the era of the monster trains, which were every bit as massive as their nickname suggests. In 1844, an excursion from Leeds to Hull reportedly took 7,800 day trippers in 250 carriages, hauled by 10 locomotives.
Millions of people were catching the railway bug, leading to an era of true mass transportation. And it was good news for Britain's picturesque towns, many of which were on the coast. They could throw themselves open to business. The seaside holiday had arrived.
It was born here, Fleetwood, a resort on the Lancashire coast that was created because of the railways. The land, initially no more than a series of sand dunes, was transformed into a new town and seaport designed to cater for this new era of tourism. In 1840, the first passengers arrived in search of sun, sea and sand along the Preston and Wyre Joint Railway. Dick Gillingham is a local historian with the Fleetwood Museum.
This was the first place from the Lancashire workers' point of view which they could reach by train. Just 6 years later the railway reached Blackpool and Lytham, and then in years beyond that other resorts were reached by the railway.
And how many people were the townspeople originally expecting to turn up?
They were expecting a very limited number of passengers, just 20,000 passengers for the year probably, and in fact 20,000 came in the first month. And in the first year of operation, the first summer season, if you like, over 100,000 people came on the train, a terrific number for a town which at the time only had a population of 2,500. So it was a huge boost to the trade of the town.
And for somebody coming from a smoky industrial town, somewhere like Chorley or Bolton or Preston, arriving here, what would that experience have been like?
Well, when they got off the train, it's just a short walk to the beach, obviously the terrific vista in front of them. The Lakeland hills, magnificent views. It was an awe-inspiring thing to look out there and wonder where it all ended, really.
In the 1840s, the seaside holiday business, previously the preserve of the rich, embraced the mass market. Many of those travelling would have done so down this very line, now known as the East Lancashire Heritage Railway. In the 19th century, the line provided vital links between the industrial towns of the north and the nation's favourite coastal getaways.
Different seaside resorts attracted different clientele. Blackpool became a mecca for Lancashire's working classes, while Southport appealed to the slightly better off customer. Morecambe served the West Riding textile towns and became known as Bradford by the Sea.
The new rail connections were making beach holidays possible all over the country, from Weston-super-Mare to Scarborough, Eastbourne to Torquay, and Bournemouth to Skegness.
Beaches will always attract holidaymakers, but in industrial Victorian Britain there was one more simple, healthy attraction that was now easy to reach: clean air.
The Lake District had already been attracting well-heeled visitors and artists, drawn to its dramatic landscapes. William Wordsworth, one of our great romantic poets and a native of the lakes, had written a guidebook which was proving popular. His famous poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, was inspired by the sight of daffodils on the shores of Ullswater. Many others now wanted to sample the same air and increase their contact with nature. The railways made that possible. The Furness Railway, now known as the Lakeside and Haverthwaite Heritage Railway, was historically used for moving coal and iron ore. But it was tourists who were increasingly being brought into the lakes by rail.
But Wordsworth was horrified by the prospect of trainloads of working class people descending upon his beloved lakes. As a new line was proposed between Kendal and Windermere, Wordsworth launched a campaign against it. He believed that bringing in uncultured travellers would destroy the beauty of the places they'd come to enjoy. For Wordsworth, these were the wrong sort of tourists. As for holiday pastimes, he wrote, if a scene is to be chosen suitable to them for persons thronging from a distance, it may be found elsewhere at less cost of every kind.
Wordsworth's campaign failed, and the line opened in 1847. But one of the ironies surrounding the poet was that while he was against tourism, he himself would become one of the lake's greatest tourist attractions. Wordsworth's great-great-great-great-grandson still owns Rydal Mount, the house where the poet lived and died.
Well, I think he was sort of partly a poet liking to be a recluse, but partly wanted the public acclaim. So you have this slight balance. He had, on average, 600 people a year coming through the house, and these people would have been well-to-do people. It's a bit of a struggle to get here. You're actually making a slight pilgrimage. You're coming to see a great poet. And that is a wonderful thing. He would have loved that because he could have gone off into the hills and read his poetry. They could have come here, been given refreshment by his wife and his daughter and his sister and the other women of the house, and then he could have come in and held court temporarily, and then out he goes. And that would have been played up to his ego, because towards the end of his life he undoubtedly had an ego.
And by the time the railways had expanded and more people were coming to the area, do you think that Wordsworth was part of a bygone age?
The railways opened here in 1840s, and he died in 1850, so he was right at the end of his life. The industrial age was coming. There was no getting away from that, and therefore, his age was coming to an end and the new age was starting. Having said that, he wrote a very famous, which he actually was very fond of, his Guide to the Lakes, which ironically was encouraging people to come to the Lake District. And therefore, he had this slight paradox of, I've written this book, people should come to the lakes, and yet they're all going to come up and ruin the lakes. So it was this slight double-edged sword he had.
To be fair, Wordsworth wasn't the only one who was nervous about the impact of the railways. The passengers themselves often questioned the wisdom of travelling by train.
It took a bit of courage to go on your first train, because it must have been a very mysterious experience. Here was this engine which somehow generated the power to pull along maybe a dozen carriages. How did it work? How did it get its power? And would it explode, which was something that did happen occasionally. Excursion trains were slightly more prone to accidents than regular trains. That's because they tended to be longer, they were running at irregular times, so sometimes signallers kind of forgot about them. They often used older rolling stock, so they had more than their fair share of serious accidents. So there was a little bit of trepidation about taking this new mechanical way of getting around. But most people managed to set their fears aside and take the plunge because of the advantages that the railways offered.
The 1851 Chester Cup was a great success, but the day was marred with tragedy. Returning home from the race meeting, 9 people were killed when excursion trains crashed in a tunnel between here and Manchester.
By June 1851, the Bolton Chronicle had had enough. Each week now brings its batch of railway disasters as regularly as the world turns round. Accidents are not to be waited for, but prevented. And to delay improvements is neglect criminal in fact, if not in law.
Despite the concerns over safety, that very same year would also see millions of people take advantage of the railways to travel to the great metropolis, many for the first time in their lives.
As well as opening up isolated parts of the country, the railways placed the capital within much easier reach of the general public, and this would make all the difference when the Great Exhibition opened in London.
The exhibition was a brainwave of Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. It was conceived as a grand display of the wonders of industry from around the world and was to be temporarily sited in London's Hyde Park in a glass structure nicknamed the Crystal Palace. Pictured here in later years, the palace was designed by Sir Joseph Paxton, a director of the Midland Railway, and it was the trains that brought the crowds, an average of 40,000 a day, 6 million over a 6-month period.
The Great Exhibition of 1851 was a real watershed for leisure mobility for ordinary people. But the Great Exhibition was important in other ways as well. For many people, it was the first time they'd seen huge crowds of ordinary people in great numbers. And of course, the 1840s was a time when there were great worries about Chartism, about riots, about crowd unrest. So the working classes had a bit of a reputation, and people were actually quite genuinely worried that if there was a big crowd of ordinary people, they would somehow cause a riot. And for the first time, the commentators said, well, actually, these people are quite well behaved. So it was, again, a watershed for perceptions of the working class in great numbers.
The signal was given, and 1,000 tons of steel and glass came hurtling to the ground.
The Crystal Palace came to a fiery and indeed explosive end, but it ushered in a new era for London as an excursion destination for people up and down the country. According to the Times, 30 years ago, not one countryman in 100 had seen the metropolis. Now there is scarcely one in the same number who has not spent a day there.
The passing of the Bank Holidays Act in 1871 helped to develop the idea of the weekend short break and created more opportunities for special excursion trains. By the turn of the century, resort towns like Blackpool were really hitting their glory days.
A popularity that would continue well into modern times.
Yes, you feel you're really on top of the world. How can you be down in the dumps when your heart's up in the clouds and you can throw away cares to the four winds? This is the height of happiness.
But these huge numbers of holidaymakers would simply not have been possible without the railways. Not only as a mass form of transport, but also as a force for social change.
It wasn't true that Blackpool only started when the railway came, but certainly in 1846, when the branch line reached Blackpool, it heralded an awful lot of visitors and meant that there were very soon changes to Blackpool. They laid out streets and walks. We developed hotels, lodgings, churches, gasworks, water supply. So it made a tremendous difference to the infrastructure in Blackpool.
As the Edwardian era dawned, marketing of seaside towns reached new levels of sophistication.
The National Railway Museum in York has an extensive collection of railway posters featuring resort towns from up and down the British coast.
By the end of the 19th century, the railway companies began to use colour lithography, and they had much better illustrations. Sometimes they would be made by the publishers, but increasingly they began to use artists to actually create their posters for them. The advertising is quite aspirational. The pictures are quite carefully selected. They're telling a story. So if you look at the posters for Fleetwood, for example, in the 1930s, they're advertising the Marine Hall and the Lido.
It's really something to look forward to,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Well,
You
yeah.
spend all your year working.
Yeah, and of course these appeared in railway stations with a lot of steam trains in and out. Those railway stations could look pretty grimy and often quite sombre colours, and you've got really vibrant posters carefully positioned to catch the eye.
So this is really advertising as a profession, isn't it?
Poster advertising had been around for some time, but the railway companies began to take it really seriously, and they had people whose job it was specifically to grab customers and get them to travel by rail.
Railways made all kinds of outdoor activities and recreational trips possible, from cycling and rambling to angling and golf.
The railways transformed the world of sport, making countrywide competitions possible and driving the formation of national sporting leagues.
This is the Sir Alex Ferguson stand.
Graham Simmons works for the Manchester United Museum and has supported the club all his life.
It all began around about 1878 when a group of engineers and coach builders who worked for Newton Heath Railway Depot, they wanted to form a football club. And so they went to their employer to ask for their help, which they agreed to. And from that, the team was known as Newton Heath, Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Cricket and Football Club.
When this film was shot in 1902, the club had just changed its name. Playing here in the slightly darker tops, they were now known as Manchester United.
The old Newton Heath Club of 1902, now seen rushing to say how do.
It was the railways which had allowed clubs up and down the country to grow, not least because it meant that supporters could now travel far and wide for away matches.
From humble beginnings to a group of railway workers that worked hard all week, and then they played football on a Saturday afternoon as a form of leisure, as a form of escape. With the help of the railways, we've grown into a national and global football club.
From prize fights to football and temperance meetings to beach breaks, the railways changed how Britons came to see and experience leisure.
Nowadays our habits have changed. Many of us own our own cars and we're just as likely to sun ourselves on the Costa del Sol as we are in Scarborough.
But it's amazing to think how many of the leisure opportunities we now enjoy were first made possible by the railways. By collapsing space and time, these thundering beasts helped us connect as a nation in all kinds of unexpected ways.
And today, well, it's fitting that all across the country there are restored heritage railways where people come for a day out to experience the wonders of steam power, nearly 200 years after their transformation of our national culture and sense of identity. That's quite a tribute.